Really, design preservation lead is happening to welcome you to the Deauville Center annual Art Composition celebration. We're celebrating Florida's historical communities. My name is Samantha Sidmore, I'm the Secretary of the Board of Education. For those of you who are not with us, then you can visit our website and that board and budget members. Members receive 2 tours, a gift shop discount, and I don't newsletter that tells you about the lecture that. But more than that, your donation is supported of ongoing efforts to preserve, promote, protect the environment and community member. This year we've seen that historic preservation as a critical function in the state of Florida, and we are working on it to preserve our community. I would like to, before I introduce Scott Kealing, the speaker, I want to introduce one of our real estate commissioners, who's a former board member of MVPL. Her name is Tanya Guy, who's still
Good evening. It is a thrill to see this room so full. There are so many great events here year-round, and certainly this weekend, and I'm thrilled to see you all taking good advantage of this. You're witnessing a very small historic moment in my life, because Bob and I met by an email. I don't even remember how we were connected, but to try to save the late lamented Deauville Hotel, which we'll figure in the story a little bit. I always dreamt to make it to the cover of the New York Times. I never dreamt I would make it discussing why we should try to save this historic this important piece of architectural and cultural history, not just because of the US, but because of so many other things that happened there. I'm thrilled to finally personally look. It's great if you haven't read it yet. I don't know, waiting for it, buy one, buy multiples, give them to your kids, to your friends and neighbors for gifts. But I do also want to be serious for a moment, because we are under attack as a coastal community, but in an important and diverse architectural community and legacy like we've never been before. I'm literally flying to Tallahassee on Tuesday to be in the committee that is hearing the Unsafe Structures Act, and the low black that I passed last year. The version that's coming up this year is slightly better. The gambling thing, but if you've never been motivated to be an activist before, this is the time to get involved. And even if you don't live on any beach, if you want some guidance on who to reach out to and some talking points, my email is easy to remember. It's TANYA, Tanya, with a Y, TANYA, at miamibeachfl.gov. And I'm happy to send you any information you might need about how to get involved, the various resources that are out there. NBL is leading to fight locally, along with many other nonprofit organizations. So anyhow, enough of the serious stuff. Well, it is really serious, but let's talk about history and why it matters to London here. And Sandy is going to be honest with you, Bob. Thank you.
So this lively presentation exam is in 2 weeks the Beatles spent in the potboiler that was 1962 in Florida. Longer than anywhere else in North America, but that watershed year. So South Florida is the center state. It's the subject of Kealing, Seaboard, Good Day, Sunshine State, happened in Beatles Rocked Florida. But we'll also address the tragedy of Brooksing and Deauville Hotel, one of the most important Beatle landmarks in North America. So a little bit about Bob Kealing. So Bob Kealing is a 6-time Emmy-winning retired broadcast journalist, 2-time recipient of the Murrow Award. He's the founder of 4 touring heritage sites, including the Jack Kerouac House in Orlando, which is in the National Register of Historic Places. He's the author of 5 and 15 books. So please welcome Bob Kealing.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you, MDPL. Thank you for all you do to try to save these incredibly historic buildings. Just walking down Ocean Drive, those iconic Art Deco buildings and hotels. Anybody get sick of making that walk, even if you're local? No. It's wonderful. This book was a labor of love. The more I started to get below the surface, the more it was just like peeling back layers of the onion and finding so much that was there. Before I set the stage with just a short reading from the book, I want to draw attention to these pictures here. The one on the left, you probably recognize that if you're into the Beatles at all. That was them on South Beach, February of '64, almost exactly 60 years ago now. George Harrison's 20. Look at him. Now, I know it's hard to see, but George has got this big smile on his face, and he's got this camera around his neck, and he's usually the dour, sort of suspicious one. These smiles are real. Paul McCartney later said this was the first time we'd seen real beaches and palm trees. And I don't know if you all have seen his book, Eyes of the Storm, the beautiful coffee table book. He did that. He was taking pictures himself during their first visit to the United States in '64. And I emphasize visit. You know, when they came to be on Ed Sullivan, it wasn't a proper tour. They went to New York, Washington, D.C., then they came to Miami. And just a suggestion of the gravity of how important it was to Paul. When he came to Miami, he switched to color film. And I really believe this is where the Beatles fell in love with America. Now, this is a little more recent, this picture. This was Paul in Orlando in 2022. Just a couple of weeks before he turned 80.
Wow.
We're going to talk about him. And we're going to talk about why I took that picture and the importance of it to this story. Also, just in terms of sources, I just want to talk about how fortunate I was to have to do more than 30 primary source new interviews with people who toured with the Beatles, met the Beatles, covered the Beatles, had the Beatles come to their house for their first home-cooked meal in America. Is an amazing story. And this is a handwritten letter, 4-page letter from Paul to their bodyguard here in Miami Beach. And this guy was like right out of Central Casting, and we're going to talk about him too. So this is from the Hard Rock collection, and it was amazing to have access to these primary source documents and artwork and photos. Made it that much more special. And I thought I'd include this picture here too. This is the Beatles' first autograph that they signed in Florida. How do I know that? This is on the back of a card that their limo driver gave them. And the ticket where he's assigned to go pick them up at the airport has it, go pick up the Beatles and take them to the Deauville. Okay, let me set the stage real quick to give you some context about the importance of their visit. The historic events of 1964 included a Beatle residency in Florida as performers, then as tourists. Once their professional obligations were over, they devoured all the trappings of beach life in winter: sun, sand, women, celebrities, convertibles, fantastic yachts, and opulent homes. Now, for a group of skinny, pale, mop-top, chain-smoking Brits from working-class Liverpool who had paid plenty of dues to all America had to offer. It was also a rare opportunity to spend quality time in one place, sunny Florida, time they would not have anywhere else in America later that year as their careers skyrocketed, and they embarked on an unprecedented North American tour later that summer. That remarkable tour would bring the Beatles back to Florida for an unscheduled visit to Key West, then on to Northeast Florida, where weeks earlier, MLK's ideology of nonviolent protest had been put to a severe test. By then, the Beatles, too, were doing their part to ensure social justice prevail. At the start of a year like no other for the Beatles and the fans who fell in love with them, John, Paul, George, and Ringo needed to achieve just one more goal that they had set before meeting their American destiny, having a #1 single in America. In 1964, Floridians bore witness to the 3 stages of the Beatles' remarkable impact: innocence, influence, and activism. Oh, well, thank you. So let's talk about that first #1 smash. I heard somebody singing a song in here earlier. And, you know, I grew up the youngest of 6 kids, okay? And so I inherited all my sister's original Beatles vinyl, which was pretty cool. So while the other kids are listening to, I don't know, the Carpenters or something, I'm listening to Revolver, Hard Day's Night, all that good stuff. But I was growing up, there were always 2 songs that I associated with the Beatles breaking out in America. 2 songs. One of them was I Want to Hold Your Hand. The other one was She Loves You. Yeah. So, you know, one of those songs, when it was released in America, bombed. And the other one was the huge hit that set them on their way on this rocket ship to fame. How many of you think the big song was I Want to Hold Your Hand? Hands up, come on. Oh, stop being so shy. Come on, raise your hand. I Want to Hold Your Hand. Okay. How many thought it was She Loves You? Okay. Well, we're going to find out. This guy I interviewed, John Prusty, was a sailor in Key West who met the Beatles down there. And initially, that's why I wanted to interview him, talking about what it was like running into them. You know, he had a great story of being at the bar at the Key Wester and almost running right into Paul McCartney and spilling a beer on him as Paul was trying to go after the same stewardess as he was. But as a good interviewer, what you want to do is listen with great intent. Because at the end of our interview, John sort of just happened to mention his experience of hearing the Beatles for the very first time. He said he was on a deserted highway out in suburban Illinois. It was the middle of the night, and he had his brother-in-law's Buick. It was around Christmas of '63. And he might have had a couple, maybe. So it's snowing, and he's doing everything he can to stay awake. So he turns on the radio in his brother-in-law's car, and on comes WLS, the bright sound of Chicago town, or whatever it was. And he said, this music came on with the urgent beat he had never heard before. I'm not going to sing it. I don't want you guys to all flee the room. Oh yeah, tell you something. I think you understand. When I say that something, I want to hold your hand. That was the song that broke it for the Beatles in the United States. She Loves You was released on the Tiny Swan label months before and didn't do anything because it didn't have promotion. And in fact, it was even played on American Bandstand, and the kids kind of laughed at them when they saw a picture. So it was I Want to Hold Your Hand that broke everything big for the Beatles. And I'm so thankful to John for his story because it was just amazing. He just said that music, and it is as a postscript to the story. Yeah, remember, this is right after JFK, and the nation is in this collective malaise. And he goes, you know, it finally felt okay to smile again. He goes, I was so happy hearing this new song that I actually started doing donuts in the middle of the highway. In the middle of the night, in the snowy Chicago night. But what an image about the impact of hearing the Beatles for the first time. You can't tell this story without also relating the African-American experience. And this young woman, Kitty Oliver, grew up in the streets of West Jacksonville. And she said, you know, this was before desegregation. She said it was almost like apartheid. She said, I never saw a white person, except maybe an insurance man every once in a while. But I was listening to Wape the Big Ape, and I heard this group, Wape the Big Ape, the radio station in Jacksonville. And she said, I heard this group and their harmonies, you know, they just kind of reminded me of some of the girl groups that I really like the Shirelles. So she was immediately attracted to them, and she saw pictures like this one in fan magazines. You obviously know who that is. That's Little Richard. And that's the Beatles when they were opening for him over in Europe. Anything unusual about the picture? Anything?
Wow.
They're touching. They're touching. And, you know, it's interesting. One of the things John Trusty told me was when he was at the Key Wester, he saw Ringo swimming with one of the warm-up acts on their tour, the Exciters, the wonderful African-American girls from Jamaica, Queens. And John was taken aback. He was like, he couldn't believe that they were actually swimming in the same pool. So it gives you a snapshot of the time period this was. But when Kitty found out that the Beatles were going to be playing at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, she decided she was going to raise enough money to go. And the tickets were $5. So she delivered groceries and cleaned houses to make enough money to go. But her story is pretty amazing as the events of that watershed year started to unfold. So let's go back to Miami Beach. Here's our bodyguard. Now, did anybody know Buddy Dresner by any chance? The reason I asked that is once I wrote a book about Graham Parsons, the tragic country rocker, and I was in his hometown of Winter Haven, and I asked the same question. And this older lady kind of raises her hand a bit haltingly, and she goes, well, I was his driver's ed teacher. So I asked. But Buddy was the sergeant on the night shift for the Miami Beach Police Department, and he's trying to get some sleep one day at his home, and he gets a knock on the door, and it's a junior officer, and he's not happy because he's been trying to sleep, so he flings the door open, and what do you want? Well, you need to go see the captain because you've been assigned to be the security guard for the Beatles. And he's like, what the hell is Beatles? What are you talking about? He had no idea. Buddy could not have been a better person. He became their bodyguard, their confessor, their father figure, their big brother. He just could not have been a better person to provide security while they were in South Beach for almost 9 days, including he had the responsibility of making sure that the Beatles got on stage on time at the Deauville for the second appearance on Ed Sullivan's show. And for his time, he was paid the grand sum of $3. This is the Beatles book, which was their fanzine. All the insiders talked about the stories of the Beatles out on the road. Here they are at Buddy Dresner's house. Buddy had been keeping the secret from his family, his daughters especially. He had 2 young daughters, that he was, the bodyguard for the Beatles. He didn't want their house being swarmed in North Miami Beach. But finally, after they were on Sullivan, he decided he would have them over for dinner. And can you imagine? If you did that today with your service revolver, yeah, you might have a problem with your bosses, but that just gives you a sense. That's Sam over at Buddy's house in North Miami Beach. Now, the wonderful thing about the research on this book was just the serendipity along the way, just the unexpected moments. This lady was one big moment. Does she look familiar at all to you? She was known around the world in 2013 She's the judge from the George Zimmerman trial, the Trayvon Martin case. Deborah Nelson. And I had done a streaming thing with Hard Rock when I was looking through their collection doing the research, and she saw it. And one day I'm sitting, I was actually writing, I was at home. She calls me up. And I couldn't believe it. She goes, well, I hear you're writing a book on the Beatles. I said, yes, Your Honor, I am. And she said, oh, call me Debbie. I said, okay, Your Honor, Debbie. She proceeded to tell me that she was Buddy Dresner's neighbor in Miami Beach. And she was about 11. And she goes, you know, I was over at their house one day because the kids could come and go as we wanted. You know, it was a typical neighborhood in the 60s. And I answered their phone when it rang. And it was Paul McCartney. So she knew something was up. See, I told you that he had them over to dinner, right? For their first home-cooked meal in America, by the way. But what they told the neighbors was Uncle Harold was coming over. Little Debbie knew different. And she finally got her playmate, Buddy's daughter, to admit, no, the Beatles are coming. And so Buddy's like, look, Buddy, if you bring a mob of people over here, they're just going to keep driving by. They're not going to stop. So she had to sit there in her house, looking out the window, as John, Paul, and George get out of the limo and go in the house, and then just sweat bullets waiting for her opportunity. Finally, she and her dad go over, knock on the door, and they cordially invited her in. And judge-to-be Deborah Nelson got to have dessert with the Beatles. And that's the card they signed for her in 1964. So just that kind of serendipity is what makes these stories just extra special. Another important story of their time in Florida, of course, was this iconic shot, right? The live cover shoot. Actually, this wasn't the cover until an anniversary issue many years later. But I had the privilege of interviewing all 5 members of the Life magazine team who made this shoot happen. And Gail Cameron is the reporter right in the middle. And she gave me the most interesting perspective. Not only was she a reporter for Life, she also covered JFK and Jackie and was in the middle of it after the assassination and talked about how debilitating it was to America's psyche. She was also at JFK when the Beatles came in. And she said, yeah, the crush of fans was so bad, a policeman actually picked me up and ushered me into the limo. And then some other guy was thrown in there. And she goes, I realized I lost my shoes. And lifted me right out of my shoes. So as she's lamenting that, she's like, where am my shoes are gone. And finally, this guy named Ringo, whom she hadn't met, will get the shoes, love. So after that, the Life people knew that this was a big deal, that the Beatles were a cultural phenomenon. And the editors in New York told Gail, hey, why don't you get on the plane with them, fly to Miami, find a swimming pool, and let's take a picture of them in the pool. Oh, and of course it needs to be private. That was her assignment. No pressure there. So this is a little bit about how this assignment happened, because there's 3 or 4 versions of how the Beatles ended up in the swimming pool. This is the version from the people who made it happen. So there was Gail Cameron and her Life magazine mission. At the beginning, when the Beatles found out what Life wanted, they were against it. They believed that the Miami leg of the trip would involve more holiday and less work. Now, given Life's emphasis on high-quality, one-of-a-kind photographs, the Beatles refused to pose in the swimming pool. The assignment would be a bust. Cameron was feeling the pressure. But she had one big advantage over most of the other journalists on South Beach: familiarity. Familiarity. During the Beatle visits to New York and D.C., And surely because Brian Epstein and company were well aware of Gail's employer's prestige and influence, she was welcome in the Beatles' inner circle. Once you gained access, formality fell away. To Cameron, the first part of her week with the Beatles had been disarmingly informal. And it didn't hurt that she was still in her 20s and had a good-humored way about her. At the Miami Bureau, Marty Durham reached out to former recording artist Jerry Pollock, who sang in big bands with Duke Ellington and Count Basie, along with her husband Paul Pollock, owner of a string of South Florida motels, including the Thunderbird. Jerry often threw lavish parties at their home on North Bay Road overlooking Biscayne Bay. The couple once hosted Frank Sinatra, who flew in his private chef from New York. Jerry said she'd be delighted to host the Beatles, with one caveat: the pool was not heated. That meant the Fab Four, should they agree to the shoot, would be wading into frigid water, at least by our standards here in South Florida. The gated home had a regal look about it, high walls for privacy and exclusivity. With the private pool home now secured, it was up to Gail Cameron to convince the Beatles to do it. She made her way up to the 12th floor at the Deauville, planning to state her case to John Lennon, the one man whose opinion mattered as much, if not more, than Brian Epstein. I thought John was incredibly interesting and complicated, Cameron said. Lennon also recognized that appearing on the cover, at the time they were thinking they were going to be on the cover of Life, could be as important for career advancement and record sales as the Sullivan Show itself. So finally, in the hallway, alone with Lennon, she made her best pitch. And to her immense relief, Lennon uttered the magic words, "Okay, love, we'll do it." Love. You call it women. That's how it came. This is John Loengard, who took the actual picture. He's another guy that could not have been more friendly. I approached him on his website, and within an hour, he's like, "Yeah, what can I do?" And he goes, "Oh, yeah, that picture. I thought it kind of stunk. I didn't think it was very good." Until one day, my teenage daughter's friend wanted to just touch my hand because I was the one who had taken that picture. And then I thought, maybe I need to rethink this. The Beatles were not the most famous people who ever made their way through the Pollock's backyard. I'll just leave that at that. How's that for a tease? And here they are at the Deauville. And one of the people I was lucky enough to introduce is the taller brother, Rob Precht, who's Ed Sullivan's grandson. And he recounted being just a few feet away from the Beatles at their sound check as they're playing that music. And he goes, "That music is absolutely burned into my soul. I remember it so well." And he said the family was so nervous for Grandpa that they actually didn't even stay at the Deauville. There was so much pressure. But the show went great. There were some audio problems. The girls went wild. And it turned out very well. And in fact, the ratings were like 70 million viewers, which put the show right up in the rarefied air with the #1 show of the day, which was, anybody? Lucy. No, not Lucy. Think lower brow. No, this is 64. So the Beverly Hillbillies, I just heard it. When I took my walk this evening, I went by what used to be the gym, and now it is a chain drugstore. But this was pretty amazing for the Beatles after the Sullivan Show to go and meet Cassius Clay. And I was lucky enough to interview Robert Lipsyte, the correspondent for the New York Times, who was actually the only one in the locker room when the Beatles sort of got shoved in there and they're all waiting for this guy to show up. See, at the time, they thought this big mouth was going to get clobbered by Sonny Liston. And then all of a sudden, he just appears. This chiseled 6'3" Greek god says, "Hey, Beatles, let's go make some money." And they immediately loved the guy. And they went out and did all of these comical pictures, and you think about this, it really is a convergence of icons who were both on the brink. A week later, as we all know, Cassius Clay beat Sonny Liston in 7 rounds. And he had actually been staying on West 15th Street. You know, this was his house. And by then, this young man was also with him, Malcolm X. And again, you just see what an important time it was in 1964 for so many cultural reasons. And he changed his name to Muhammad Ali not long after. But that was the convergence of the icon era. So after the Beatles leave, after being here 9 days, they were on Sullivan and they decided they loved it so much, they said, hey, we're going to stay another week. And the Beatles PR guy goes to Buddy Dresner, hey, I hate to tell you this, but you're going to be their bodyguard another week. He's like, what? But that was great. And another real privilege was getting to interview several of Tom Petty's bandmates, best friends, and they talked about what it was like for him as an 8th grader in Gainesville. And he said, that night I saw the Beatles on Sullivan, my world changed. It's like everything went from black and white to color. And his best buddy told me, he goes, yeah, after Tom saw that, that's all he wanted to do. That's all he wanted to do. And here he is with the Beatles wig. See that? His dad, Earl, was a very no-nonsense insurance salesman kind of guy. Yeah, we ain't having that long hair. And it got really serious as the two went back and forth. So Tom would stash his Beatles wig for gigs. But that was wonderful to see how the Beatles begat all of these other iconic musicians, a fairly large number from Florida who are now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And one of them, Tom Ledden, this is Tom right here. He was in the band. He was actually best musical friends with Tom Petty before Mike Campbell. And they were in a group called Mudcrutch. You guys hear that name, Mudcrutch? Take a look at this. 1970, some band named, how do you pronounce that? Lynyrd Skynyrd? Playing in Gainesville for $1. Yeah, I think I'd pony up $1 for that. But just those stories were wonderful. And you look at Tom over there, he had dropped out of school. Now, this was a serious part. Talking to Tom Ledden, he goes, there was one night Tom and his girlfriend showed up at my house. Tom's dad had just chased him out of the house at gunpoint because they had been at odds so much. And when I told another friend of that story, he'd never heard that. It brought tears to his eyes. That's how much Tom wanted it. That's how much he wanted it. And we just lost Tom Ledden last year. So again, so many of the sources I was privileged to interview aren't with us anymore. And it's just so important to preserve these stories. Y'all know Larry Kane, the former Miami newsman. He was this reluctant reporter who was a serious guy. He wanted to cover the Cuban exiles coming over in the civil rights movement. He didn't want to cover some bunch of mop-top boy band, flash in the pan. But he said, I was standing on the tarmac at Miami International, and the kids were pushing so hard on the jalousie windows up above me. Can you remember back in the day, you could actually stand on the tarmac, without it being some international incident. But he goes, they pushed so hard on the windows, they were falling out and crashing on the tarmac. And the kids were just so nuts. And Larry, who's a very incisive person to this day, you can still follow him on Twitter, by the way. He realized this was a big deal. So his news director convinced him, really urged him, to try to get an interview with them when they came back to Jacksonville in September. Well, Brian Epstein sort of misunderstood his request. And he said, yes, Mr. Kane, you're more than welcome to come with us on the entire North American tour. And Larry's like, you got to be kidding. He would have unprecedented access. And my problem was his mother was dying. And he just said, I can't go. I can't go. Talked to his parents. His dad was like, these guys, you shouldn't want anything to do with them. But his mother was like, no, you should go. You should go. This could change your career. It could change your life. That's exactly what happened. And John especially had a very salty way about him and decided to test Larry the first time they met in San Francisco. And he said, why are you dressed up like a sissy? Although he didn't use the word sissy. And Larry didn't know what to do. He kind of sloughed it off, interviewed the other guys, then came back to Lennon and asked him about his opinion on the buildup in Vietnam. And John's like, oh, okay. Maybe this guy does have something on the ball. And he later apologized for the comment. And he was the one asking them about their role. He was the one who asked, what if the Gator Bowl is segregated? What are you going to do? And to his credit, Paul said, we won't play there. You know, we don't get this notion that people of color are treated so differently here. You know, we just don't get it. So in their rider, on their contract, if you wanted to bring them to your town, number 6 on their rider said artists will not be required to perform in front of segregated audiences. And in 1964, that was a big risk. But there you go. That was the commitment they made. And this is why. Here are the people who are on the tour. These are the Exciters. And I was lucky enough to interview her, Lillian Moss, and also Reggie Young of the Bill Black Combo, who was also in the legendary Memphis Boys. He was a great guitarist, and neither one of them are with us anymore either. But George actually considered him a much bigger star than himself. And it was so interesting to get their first-person accounts of being on the tour, on the plane. Larry Kane told me one day, I think it was over Kansas, I see the 4 of them sort of huddled in the aisle, kind of away from everybody. And you can hear they're working on a song. It was about a song. It was about a statement that Ringo had made. You know, he would say, oh, it's been a hard day's night. Or, feels like I've been working 8 days a week. That was the song they were writing in the aisle. And Larry was privileged to see them writing this song, which is just amazing. And he said, you know, I told them they ought to speed it up a little bit. And you know what? They did. But this is why the Beatles wanted equal accommodations for everyone on the tour. They weren't going to treat anyone else differently just because of the color of their skin. And sorry, this is a little bit jumbled, but there was actually a nexus between MLK and the Beatles. It was in Jacksonville. This is after Dr. King was arrested at the Monson Motor Lodge for saying, you know, I want to sit down and have a meal with my white friends. This is while he's Time Magazine's Man of the Year. And he was arrested, spent a night in the St. Johns County Jail. Then for safekeeping, they decided they would take him in a police car with the police dog next to him up to the Duval County Jail, where he spent a night in solitary confinement. And as it turns out, that courthouse where he gave testimony and ended up being released on bond so he could go get an honorary doctorate from Yale the next day. That courthouse is right next door to where the Beatles, weeks later, had their press conference at the Hotel George Washington. So that summer, while all this was going on, the Beatles and MLK were in the very same orbit in Jacksonville, fighting the fight for equal rights. So during the tour, on September 8th, they were in Montreal, and there were death threats against Ringo. I mean, serious threats that really got them scared. So much so that they said, we're not going to stay here. We're going to get out of here. They were due to have a couple of days downtime before that Jacksonville show. There was just one little problem. September of 64. Anybody remember a name? Dora?
No.
As in Hurricane Dora? It was coming just to a direct hit on downtown Jacksonville. So they flew all night. Larry Kane told me, he said, okay, I had suggested let's go to Key West, because at least they would have some peace. Even if the kids on the mainland found out they were there, they'd at least have some time to themselves. So there's the airport, there's the Key Western Motel. They had this big giant turboprop that they barely got stopped on this tiny little runway. By the time they show up there, check it out. That's the terminal at the Key West airport. There's kids standing on the roof. So the secret got out. And this is where they stayed. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because the motel's long gone. But see this right here? That's the little cabana suite where the Beatles stayed. And after all this was knocked down and the Hyatt Windward Point was erected, they kept this building. So we have one place left in Florida where we can say the Beatles slept here. It's a snack bar now. But if I had anything to do with it, I would like it to be a Florida heritage site, because the time they spent in Key West was so important. Here's John over here in his civilian clothes. He went to a clothing store on Duval Street and they locked the door so he could shop in peace. He got the clothes for a photo shoot for Cosmopolitan magazine. They had decided he was the one Beatle who might actually have some staying power once this, all fizzles out. This kid may have something. The person writing the article was a cub reporter. Maybe you've heard of her, Gloria Steinem. And this gentleman is Coffee Butler, who was a legend in Key West, blues singer. And I was lucky enough to interview him, and he told me about going out to the Key Western and jamming with the Beatles. I goes, yeah, I definitely remember that first song was Blueberry Hill. We all loved that song. Can't remember what the second one was. It's 4 o'clock in the morning and they shut us down. And I still remember Ringo saying, let the band play. Ringo and George were backing him on the bandstand. He performed for President Truman. They finally got him in the studio at age 90 to record an album, and it's wonderful. Coffee Butler. And actually, the amphitheater in Key West is now the Coffee Butler Amphitheater, is what I was trying to say. So they made it to Jacksonville. Everything was fine, a little bit windy. But Clan wasn't there. Kitty Oliver, remember her? She bought her ticket, went there by herself, and she said she sat in the audience among whites for the first time, trying to make herself small. And nobody looked at her, she said. But she was able to be there just like anybody else. And once the Beatles got on stage, she started screaming her head off just like everybody else. But she said, the enormity of it really didn't hit me until I'd walked out of the stadium after the show, and a young brother and sister, African-American brother and sister, said, you came here alone. So for Kitty, it wasn't just seeing a concert, it was an act of courage. And she ended up meeting the Beatles and was in Ron Howard's documentary, 8 days a week. She got her doctorate, and now I believe she teaches at FAU. So 9/11/64, the only public performance the Beatles gave. Let me see if I can show you. It's going to be a little bit jumpy, but I want you to see it anyway. This is Paul McCartney. The reason I went to his show in 2022 is I wanted to gauge what Beatlemania was like after all these years, almost 60 years in. So let me see if I can play this for you. Again, it's going to come up a little bit jumpy, but I'm standing outside the loading dock with a few other fans, and here comes Sir Paul. There he is, you can see him. And you don't hear fanboy me saying, Sir Paul, how you doing? And he waved at me and gave me a thumbs up. And what makes it so much more special was I was standing next to these two young ladies. And we're just hanging out. And I mean, it was god-awful hot. This young woman has a sleeve of Beatle tattoos on her left arm. This young girl, who's about my daughter's age, when she started crying after Paul stopped and pointed at her, I missed my senior prom to see you. Her senior prom was in Mexico. She and her father had traveled from there to Orlando to see Sir Paul. So, needless to say, Beatlemania is still very much alive and well, 60 years on. And as I wrap things up, I do want to go back to the Deauville. Here they are in the main lobby. Here it is in its glory days, probably not the best picture. And then here's that. You know, Daniel and I, Tanya, we were all quoted on the front page of the New York Times saying, you know, how can this happen? But it did. And I think we just go back to why it's so important what you all are doing. And preserve the character of this wonderful community. And one other thing I'll tell you, just so this isn't somber, I think I have a few minutes for question and answer, comment, anything like that, is I had written about the house in Jacksonville. Elvis's first million seller was actually written, Heartbreak Hotel. I wrote a book called Elvis Ignited. And just a week ago, the gentleman who owns the house now says, I read your book and I'm going to apply to have it landmarked. So there's a victory. So depending on how much time I have, I don't think I have any time. Can we take a couple questions? A couple questions. Yes, in the back.
Me?
Yes.
So I was interested in what Ringo is Everett on the office.
He was an anti-Semitic group. I had an issue with his big nose. And he goes, I'm still not Jewish.
Long way.
I would hope so. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Know anything about the line moving from Miami to the OAC?
Yeah, that was, I do remember hearing that. It doesn't have to do with this time period. I got to think about it because it's an acronym, but I can't remember exactly what it is.
Starts with the British Airways.
There you go, British Airways. So I guess I don't know, but I will tell you, Mitch over at Books and Books had a great story about Paul McCartney showing up at the store one night in 2011 looking for some Dickens. Beatles love Florida. And I will tell you this, too, at the time John, fortunately, was assassinated, he owned a house in Palm Beach that he and Yoko were renovating. And, you know, it's funny, Larry Kane went on to be an iconic team in Philadelphia. And when John was promoting Walls and Bridges in '74, he actually came on Larry's newscast and did the weather. So it's just, that's the wonderful thing about the time they spent in Florida, where the relationships that were real. And when Buddy Dresner in 2000, signed everything. And if you're interested in Buddy's story, his son has a website, buddyandthebeatles.com, where you can see like the orders that Buddy got to guard the Beatles. Barry did like a 3-hour oral history with his dad and said, yes, you can have access to it. So I've got, you know, Buddy's comments of guarding the Beatles. What an amazing time. One of the time after the Life magazine shoot, they're on a cruise of Biscayne Bay. And he said, okay, this is going to be a good time to put these boys down. So there's Buddy going, now look, this fame thing is not going to last. Get yourself a good lawyer, put your money away. And they're like, okay, sure, bud, you know, this all right. But that was the relationship he had with them. And there's so many stories of, you know, had he not got them on the Sullivan Show on time, and they almost didn't, because they didn't have a green room. And so the Beatles, after this long rehearsal where there were all these technical problems, went up to their room to eat this wondrous new American delicacy that they had discovered, grilled cheese. And they were not coming back down until they had their grilled cheese. And Ed got up to introduce them and actually had to pitch to a Lipton tea commercial because Buddy's trying to get him through the kitchen and on stage. And he said, I was literally just pushing them on stage as Ed was cueing them. So, but thank you all so much for your kind attention. I really enjoyed sharing your story. Thank you.